My name is Ethan, and this is a tutorial series on how my team, 654X, did autonomous during the high-stakes season. So what I'm going to be showing off is some setups to create odometry pods. And essentially what an odometry is it's a way to get your robot's position in X and Y coordinates. So as we can see here, we have a robot at -3, -3, and we have a ring at 4, 4. So by traditional means, we would want to turn the robot right 45 degrees and drive forward. So that can be pretty inconvenient when you're at like different positions on the field, like if you're in the middle of an autonomous route. But with odometry, we basically, since we always know where this ring is, it's always going to be at 4, 4, we can turn to the point 4, 4 and drive to it. So no matter where we are, we know where that position is. We can always turn and drive to it. So in order to create odometry, we need 3 tracking wheels. And they're basically unpowered wheels, and we're just getting the angle of the wheel. And so the way you do that is you'd have a tracking wheel to the left of the center of the robot, one to the right, and then one behind the tracking center. And what the left and right tracking wheels would do is they can actually calculate the robot's heading. But luckily we have an inertial sensor which gets the robot's heading, so we can just run this setup here, where we have an inertial sensor for the heading, we have a sideways tracker, and then a forward tracker. And so how that works is if we were to push the robot forward, the forward tracker would engage and that would increase our Y. Or if we were to push the robot right, that would engage the sideways tracker and that would increase our X direction. Okay, so now on to actually how to build that. So I have a Fusion folder in the description, and you're going to access that and download these files here. And so right now what I'm in the chassis that I've provided. So this is a 450 RPM drivetrain, and it doesn't really matter what drivetrain you run with odometry. All that really matters is that your wheels, they are as perpendicular to each other and like straight as they can be. You just want them built like well. And you also want them in contact with the floor. So I have 4 different tracking wheels that I've provided. So the first one is this one right here. And so this one's very easy to build. It's just a C-channel, rotation sensor, 2-inch Omni, and some brass inserts inside. But the main issue with this wheel is that the 2-inch Omni wheels are not perfectly circular, so this wheel won't be in contact with the ground 100% of the time. And the other issue is that this attachment point is very weak. And like I've mentioned earlier, if your wheels bend at all, your robot will not track correctly. So you really want to make sure that these pods are rigid. So I wouldn't recommend building this unless you don't really care like how, or if you don't want your odometry to be super accurate. The next pod that I have is an improved version of the last one. So what this uses is it uses 2 2-inch Omni wheels. And the reason why you do that is because if you offset them 30 degrees from each other, it basically will cover the gaps of the one behind it. And that'll allow the wheels to stay in contact with the ground a lot nicer. And the way to do that is you basically want to pull the inserts out of this wheel, and then you want to sand them like so on the sides. And then you want to put them back into the Omni wheel, but making sure the sanded edges are in between these 2 arrows. And then you want to place them together so that way the wheels are facing the same direction. So as you can see here, this wheel has its arrow pointing outward. You want to make sure this wheel's arrow is also pointing outward too. And they should be offset by 30 degrees. So here's what they look like kind of overlaid on top of each other, and it should look like this. So the next tracking pod that I have is from Echo, and this is called a Leafspring odometry pod. And what this uses is, this one is actually the first pod that's going to remain in contact with the ground. And the reason for that is because it has this polycarb piece. I'm going to link the Echo's video to this. I don't think I can explain that very well, but go watch their video in the description. And then finally, the last pod that I'm going to be showing, and this is the pod that I would recommend all teams to build if you want the most accurate odometry and you have access to laser cutting. And so the reason for that is because this wheel is supported on both sides, and it has a very strong mounting point in the back, so it can stay straight to the robot. It won't bend at all. It does require some interesting techniques to make though. So what we have here is the wheels. So we have a spacer in here, and so you want to use the 1/4 inch spacer, 1/4 OD from RoboSource, and you want to shove that inside of here. And the reason for that is so that way the wheels, this insert sits in between the wheels, so the wheels have a little bit less slop, which will help. And then the other thing is this polycarb piece. It uses round inserts inside the poly piece, so that way the axle can remain straight. And one last thing is I use a capped axle here, a 3-inch capped axle. You don't necessarily need this. You can just add a shaft collar on the other side. And then also on some drivetrains, you may need to sand the screw. It's a 1.25-inch screw, and you may need to sand that so the way it fits, the odometry pod fits properly. So now I'm going to show what it looks like to have them mounted. So we have a forward tracker and a sideways tracker here. And as you can see, the screw is cutting to the motor, so you would need to sand that screw down. But the way you want to attach these is you can change this amount of spacing based on what you want. And you want to put a screw in here, and then put a screw in the standoff, and you want to clamp this screw that's attached into here with the screw on top. So that way this tracking pod remains stably in there. And one other thing to mention is that these screws that are screwed into the standoffs, you want to make sure you're using Loctite. So that way these screws don't come loose and affect the tracking pod's rigidity. So make sure you do that. Oh, for the Loctite, I recommend using Thread Locker Blue, as it's removable. So you can use the screws later. And then the other tracking setup that I've added is these doubled pods. And so these are, I have them hard mounted. And so that means they're not going to be pivoting towards the ground. So with the previous pods, these pods will actually rotate into the ground, and you can rubber band them. I'll put a pic on screen of what it looks like to have these rubber banded. But these aren't, I don't have them rubber banded just because there's not a good way to put these on a pivot without it bending. So just be very careful that your wheels do not bend. And then finally, the last thing you want to do is you want to mount your inertial sensor. So the recommended way to do it is you want to put it upright, and then you want to put it on a piece of adhesive foam. And the reason for that is because when the robot vibrates, it can cause this inertial sensor to get off a little bit. It's degrees. So just keep that in mind. And some other things that I do want to mention too is when you're building this pod, washers I'm using in CAD are the RoboSource Teflon washers. So if you want to make it as accurate as possible, I'd recommend using those washers. And the last thing is, due to the new poly restrictions, you don't really want to be using 2 entire poly pieces on a tracking pod. So I do have the DXF file of the tracking pod with a strip connecting the two. And you'll basically put a heat gun right here, and right here, and you want to bend them 90 degrees down, so that way they'll look like this, but with just a strip on top. And that'll make it so you only use one poly piece per tracking pod. So I will leave resources in the description to help out. I'll link the odometry paper, and then I'm also going to be linking VEX CAD Discord. So I'd recommend joining that if you want to see other people's designs. And you can also message me on Discord. My username's Ethan Mick. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments or message me on Discord. I'd love to answer them. Anyways, that's it for part 1. Part 2, I'm going to be going over how to set up odometry in a coding template. So stay tuned for that.